Missouri Supreme Court sets an execution date for a man accused of raping and murdering a 9-year-old girl in southwest Missouri.
How painful would that injury have been?
Very painful.
Stella, Missouri is the kind of small town that makes other small towns look big. Quiet, peaceful, the kind of place where, on paper, nothing ever happens. But in 2007, something happened there that turned the whole town upside down. A 9-year-old girl vanished from her own bedroom in the middle of the night. No warning, no trace, no witnesses. And what followed became one of the most baffling cases local law enforcement had ever worked. Rowan Ford was born on April 11, 1998, in San Diego, California. Not long after she was born, her mother, Colleen, split from her father, the man she'd had 3 other kids with besides Rowan, and moved to Stella. This town sits in Missouri with a population of somewhere around 150 to 160 people. We're talking tiny, quiet streets, friendly neighbors, and for the kids growing up there, everything they needed was right within reach. A school, plenty of other kids their age nearby. Colleen eventually remarried. Her new husband was David Spears, and the two of them moved in together and built a blended family. Not long after, they had their first child together, a baby girl. Now, Rowan had 2 brothers and 2 sisters, and she was close with all of them. To help support the family, Colleen took a job at the local Walmart, while David worked on a farm. Like any big family, they had their share of problems and challenges, but by all accounts, they were a genuinely happy household. By 2007, 9-year-old Rowan was in 4th grade at the local school. People described her as a ray of sunshine, polite, friendly, always smiling, always laughing. She loved playing outside with friends and riding her bike around town. On weekends, she went to Sunday school, where she was always the first one to jump in and help a friend who needed it. Since both parents worked long hours, the kids in that house grew up pretty independent, used to being home alone and looking after themselves. That's exactly how it was on the night of November 2nd. David was running late at the farm, and Colleen had left for her night shift at work. On the morning of November 3rd, around 9 a.m., Colleen came home. Rowan wasn't there to greet her like she normally was, so Colleen went to check on her in her room. Rowan wasn't there. Colleen checked the entire house, the yard. Nothing. She immediately asked her husband where their daughter was. David told her that Rowan had asked to sleep over at a friend's house, and he'd let her go without thinking twice about it. He hadn't even asked which friend. Stella was so small that there really weren't many options. Everyone in town, not just David and Colleen, knew every single one of Rowan's friends. There were only a handful of houses she could possibly be at, but Colleen couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, so she started going door to door, checking every one of them. Nobody had seen her, not one house. In fact, none of them had even been expecting her that night. Colleen walked the entire town, checked every spot she could think of, and came up empty every single time. Nobody had seen her daughter anywhere. That's when the panic really set in. She went home and told David everything. He tried to calm her down, told her Rowan would probably turn up soon, that they just needed to wait a little longer. But hours passed, and Rowan never came home. Colleen couldn't wait any longer. She called 911. The local sheriff's department responded immediately. Sheriff Ken Copeland put together a search team and went straight to Colleen's house to personally question David, since he was the last person to have seen Rowan. David walked him through the events of the previous night, the same story he'd already told his wife more than once. David and his friend and co-worker, Christopher Collings, had stayed late at the farm to finish up some work, and at some point, their mutual friend, Nathan Mahurin, had swung by to join them. The 3 of them were happy to see each other and ended up talking for a while, and by the time the work was done, nobody really felt like calling it a night. So they stopped by a convenience store, grabbed some beer, and headed over to David's place. They sat around drinking and just hanging out. Later on, Christopher suggested they head to his place instead. He lived in the neighboring town of Winton, about 10 or 15 minutes from Stella, and they kept the night going there. Before he left his own house, David said he'd checked in on Rowan. She was already asleep, so he figured she'd be fine. The guys piled into their vehicles and drove out to Winton to keep drinking. On the way, they stopped for more alcohol, then finally made it to the trailer where Christopher lived. They kept drinking for about another hour, trading stories and laughing about old memories, before deciding to call it a night. David asked Nathan to drive him home, and Nathan agreed without any issue. But since both of them had been drinking pretty heavily, Nathan decided to skip the main road and take the back way through the fields instead. Said the main road had a higher chance of running into a police patrol or a checkpoint. So the two of them said goodbye to Christopher and headed out to drop David off at home. By the time David got there, he was drunk and exhausted, so he went straight to bed and passed out. Later, according to him, Rowan woke him up and asked if she could spend the night at a friend's house. David said yes without really thinking about it, and went right back to sleep. Naturally, Colleen and the police had a lot of questions. Why would a 9-year-old ask to go sleep over at a friend's house in the middle of the night? And why would David let her go without asking a single follow-up question? The whole story painted David as someone who was either hiding something or somehow involved in her disappearance. Meanwhile, the whole town had joined the search. Volunteers combed through Stella and the surrounding area. Missing posters for Rowan went up everywhere. Calling this a shock to the town doesn't even begin to cover it. Up until that point, kids in Stella ran around with basically zero restrictions. Nobody was drilling rules into them like, don't talk to strangers, or don't get in a stranger's car, even though, in hindsight, maybe they should have. But the thing was, strangers basically didn't exist there. Everyone genuinely knew everyone. And now, not a single kid was outside playing. People were terrified. Everyone who could pitched in to search and to support and comfort Colleen however they could. The first day of searching turned up nothing. The next morning, police drove out to Winton to question Christopher Collings. He was visibly shaken, said his friend David hadn't even told him about what happened yet, but he backed up David's story completely. Then, police brought in the third friend, Nathan. His version lined up perfectly with both David's and Christopher's accounts. That entire day was spent searching, with even more volunteers joining in. But again, nothing turned up. The following day, November 5th, FBI agents started arriving in Stella. Now, while local police and volunteers kept up the ground search, federal agents began investigating this as a possible abduction. The idea that Rowan had wandered off on her own in the middle of the night just didn't add up, and almost nobody bought David's version of events either. On top of that, every time investigators talked to him, small details in his story kept shifting. At first, it was minor stuff, like David being unable to pin down exactly what time he'd left the house that night, giving a slightly different answer every time he was asked. That raised some eyebrows, but it wasn't enough to build a case on. Then he said something that really threw things into question. He claimed Rowan probably hadn't actually asked his permission to leave at all. And then came a discovery that put basically everything he'd said under a microscope. Investigators learned that on the night Rowan disappeared, David had borrowed his mother's car for a stretch of time. That detail was strange on its own, like everything else he'd said. But more importantly, he hadn't mentioned it in any of his earlier interviews. That omission became one more reason to look harder at him. Forensic techs went through David's truck and his mother's car and found nothing suspicious. Investigators brought Christopher and Nathan back in for follow-up interviews. But again, nothing new. Christopher even agreed to take a polygraph to prove he was being honest, and he passed it. As Christopher was leaving the station, he ran into Clinton Clark, the Winton County Sheriff. The two men had known each other a long time, so they stopped to chat for a minute and have a smoke. Naturally, the conversation turned to Rowan Ford's disappearance. Sheriff Clark wasn't directly involved in the investigation. That was being handled by the Stella Police Department. But Clinton had known Christopher for about 17 years. He'd been close with Christopher's adoptive parents and had been there for him when his mother passed away. He knew Christopher well enough to pick up on the fact that something was off, that the man was holding something back. But the sheriff didn't push. He just said his goodbyes and wished his old friend a good day. Back at the Stella Police Department, Clinton shared what he'd noticed with the investigators working the case. He didn't want to throw an old friend under the bus, but if Christopher genuinely knew something important, it needed to come out. That's when a theory started forming. Maybe David had asked Christopher to lie, or to tweak his story slightly to cover for himself, and Christopher had gone along with it out of loyalty, and was now too scared to come clean for fear of looking like an accomplice. Since David was already the prime suspect, this theory made a lot of sense, and the investigation's focus shifted to Christopher. If they could get him to open up, even about one small detail from that night, it might finally break the case open. Sheriff Clark offered to help. He figured he could talk to Christopher as a friend and get him to open up about whatever he was hiding. If there was one person Christopher trusted, it was Clinton. It seemed like a solid plan, so everyone started pinning their hopes on Sheriff Clark. That same evening, FBI agents decided to re-interview Rowan's mother. When they arrived at Colleen's house, they found Christopher there too. He'd come by just to check on her and see how the investigation was going. The agents figured this was too good an opportunity to pass up, so they asked him a few questions on the spot. They went through his version of events one more time, and Christopher repeated essentially the same story, with one small addition. This time, he said he couldn't rule out the possibility that David was somehow involved in Rowan's disappearance. Christopher even offered to wear a wire and try to get David to open up, maybe even get him to confess. Detectives weren't ready to act on that idea yet. The next morning, search teams were still out combing the area. Police searched David's house again and re-interviewed him. Still nothing. Meanwhile, Christopher got a call from his friend Clinton, inviting him to come by the Winton Sheriff's office. Everyone was now waiting to see what would come out of that conversation. If Clinton couldn't get anything useful, this was at a dead end. Christopher showed up, told Clinton about running into the FBI agents the night before, and repeating his story to them. They talked a bit more about the case, and then Christopher headed home. But this time, Clinton was sure of it. His old friend was hiding something. The next day, November 7th, Christopher was called back into the Stella police station for another interview. This time, specifically, to get his permission to search a safe he kept at David's house. Police had since learned that Christopher had lived with David for a stretch of time when he didn't have a place of his own, and some of his belongings were still stored there. Christopher gave full consent to search his safe, his car, and his trailer. He was cooperating completely, and he agreed to answer a few more questions. This time, they asked him to confirm David's version of events, and he said that, actually, he didn't fully agree with it. And just like that, the police started pushing harder for the truth. Christopher didn't like the pressure. He felt like he was being treated like a suspect, and he told them flatly that he wasn't going to say another word if that's how this was going to go. Right after that, he drove straight to see Clinton. In a way, the two departments, Stella and Winton, ended up running a classic good cop, bad cop dynamic, with Sheriff Clark practically becoming Christopher's only safe harbor. Clinton was the one person he felt he could talk to without being treated like a criminal, so Christopher told him everything that had happened at the Stella station and said he didn't want to deal with anyone over there anymore. If they needed anything from him, they could go through Clinton. During that conversation, Sheriff Clark gently tried to get to the bottom of things. He asked what had happened, kept his tone calm and easy, and at some point, Christopher started crying. During the months he'd lived with David, he'd grown close to Rowan and the other kids. They'd spent a lot of time together, and the kids had even started calling him Uncle Chris. He couldn't hold back the tears. He said he would never hurt Rowan or any of those kids, and that he genuinely wanted to know the truth, no matter how awful it turned out to be. That day, Christopher left the Winton police station without giving any new statements. Still, Clinton relayed everything to the investigators and asked them to give Christopher a little more time to process things. On November 9th, 1 week after Rowan went missing, her body was finally found. It was in a deep pit in the middle of a field, about 10 miles outside of Stella. The only piece of clothing left on her was a single sock. The body was taken in for examination, and someone called Sheriff Clark, asking him to reach out to Christopher one more time and finally get him to say what he'd been holding back. Clinton called his friend right away and arranged to meet. The autopsy showed that Rowan had been strangled with a rope or cord. This was no longer a missing persons case. It was a murder investigation. A crowd gathered outside Colleen's house, people in their cars, some holding signs that read, "We love you, Rowan." Everyone wanted to show their support after such devastating news. But of course, Colleen was inconsolable. Sheriff Clark found Christopher in a state of real panic. He was convinced someone was following him in a car. He was terrified that now that Rowan's body had been found, people might start pointing fingers at him and looking for revenge. Clark brought him to the police station, where he'd be safe. Now that the body had been found, and the case officially classified as a homicide, Clinton sat down with Christopher again. He asked him directly, "What did David do to Rowan?" At that, Christopher broke down crying and said he didn't want to talk about it in front of other people. They needed to go somewhere with fewer witnesses around. He suggested a small bridge just outside of Winton. The sheriff agreed, and the two of them left the station. On the bridge, Christopher took a deep breath and closed his eyes, like he was gathering himself. Then he held his hands out to his old friend and said, "You should put the cuffs on me." And then he started talking. The first part of the story matched what he'd already said. He and his two friends, David and Nathan, had gone to his place and had a few drinks. When it was time to head out, David asked Nathan to drive him home, and the two of them agreed to take the back roads to avoid running into police. Once they left, a plan started forming in Christopher's head. He got in his own car and drove toward David's house. He knew that if he took the main road, he could actually beat the other two there, since they were going the long way around. The idea taking shape in his mind both terrified him and sent something dark and electric through him. He decided he was going to take Rowan, quietly, without anyone noticing. His plan was to bring her back home afterward, hoping she wouldn't recognize him. He was right. He made it to David's house first. He slipped into Rowan's room quickly and quietly, picked her up, and carried her out to his car. She was sleeping so deeply that she never woke up. Christopher drove home with her in the back seat, a little girl he knew well. And once they got there, he sexually assaulted her. Afterward, he carried her back outside. In the moonlight, she saw his face, and she recognized him. Christopher panicked. He knew that if she told people what he'd done, his life was over. So he made the decision to kill her. Sheriff Clark could barely process what he was hearing. This whole time, he'd believed David, Rowan's stepfather, was the one responsible, and that Christopher simply knew something important about him. Now, Christopher was standing in front of him on this bridge, confessing to something unthinkable, and Clark genuinely didn't know how to react. He understood now why Christopher had picked this particular bridge. It was the same spot where he'd originally planned to dump Rowan's body, before deciding it would be found too quickly. So instead, he'd driven around looking for somewhere else, and eventually found that pit out in the field near the town of Powell. When he got back home afterward, he noticed evidence of what he'd done and decided to destroy it. He put everything in a barrel, dragged it into his shed, and burned it. Once he finished telling the whole story, Christopher went with Clark to the station voluntarily. Even after everything he'd just heard, Sheriff Clark couldn't bring himself to put the cuffs on his friend. At the station, Christopher repeated his confession to the FBI agents and said he deeply, deeply regretted what he'd done. After hearing this confession, detectives now suspected the opposite of what they'd originally thought, that David had been covering for Christopher, not the other way around. They brought David in for questioning immediately. Now that Christopher had confessed, David no longer had any reason to protect his friend, and investigators expected his story to line up with what Christopher had just admitted. Instead, David's story was just as shocking. According to him, when Nathan dropped him off and he noticed Rowan was missing, his very first thought was that Christopher had taken her. That's not exactly a logical leap to make out of nowhere, which suggested that, at some point, the two men had actually talked about taking her. David said he knew immediately who was responsible, and his next move was to take his mother's car and drive straight to Christopher's place. When he arrived and saw Rowan there, instead of saving her, he chose to take part in what was happening, and afterward, he helped get rid of her body. Jesus Christ, how can anyone be that f***ing monstrous? David also claimed that for the first few days afterward, he couldn't remember anything about that night, saying his mind had essentially shut down. Nobody saw this coming. Now it looked like both men were admitting guilt, even though Christopher's confession had never once mentioned David being involved. Agents brought Christopher in again and asked him point blank whether David's account was true. He said no, his friend had nothing to do with it. Both men were arrested on suspicion of Rowan Ford's murder, but investigators still had to untangle their conflicting statements. Hair found in Christopher's car matched Rowan's. The forensic findings on the cause of death lined up exactly with what Christopher had described, details that only the actual killer would have known. On top of that, police found the burned barrel Christopher had described using to destroy the evidence. Everything matched his account, which made his version credible. There was plenty of evidence against Christopher, including his own confession. But when it came to David, there was a problem. There was a confession, but no physical evidence backing it up. Both cases went to trial, where the courts now had to determine how to sentence each man. Throughout Christopher's trial, Clinton Clark stood by him. The sheriff felt a deep sense of responsibility for what had happened, for the actions of a man he'd supported and guided his whole life. Christopher made several attempts to lessen the charges against him. He filed appeals asking the court to throw out everything he'd told police before he was formally charged, arguing he hadn't realized those statements would be used against him in court. The court rejected those appeals, ruling that he'd given his statements voluntarily. He also repeatedly brought up his difficult childhood, suggesting it may have contributed to what he did, but it had no bearing on his sentence. In 2012, the court sentenced Christopher Collings to death. He spent more than a decade on death row, exhausting every single appeal. His final requests for clemency were denied, and on December 3, 2024, at 6:10 p.m.,
the man convicted of sexually assaulting and strangling 9-year-old Rowan Ford from Southwest Missouri will be put to death tonight.
Christopher Collings was executed by lethal injection at a maximum security prison in Missouri. In his final words, he expressed remorse and accepted full responsibility for the horrific crime. Justice for Rowan Ford had finally been served, 17 years after that tragic night. As for David Spears, the court had significant doubts about his actual role in the murder. There simply wasn't enough physical evidence to back up his conflicting statements and prove he was directly involved in the killing. Ultimately, he was convicted of obstruction of justice and endangering the welfare of a child, and sentenced to 11 years in prison. But here's the kicker that absolutely broke the internet. After doing just over 7 years, David Spears walked free, and he didn't go into hiding. In a move that felt like a total slap in the face to Rowan's memory, he managed to land a government job with the Missouri Public Defender's Office, coasting on taxpayers' money for years. When the public finally caught wind of this, the outrage was deafening. Lawmakers went ballistic, sparking a massive scandal that got so intense, the state threatened to freeze the department's budget until he was gone. Under all that crushing heat, Spears was finally fired, proving that while he tried to outrun his past, the ghost of his choices caught up with him anyway. This case is a heartbreaking reminder that sometimes the biggest dangers are the ones closest to home. So please, look out for one another. Keep your kids safe, stay vigilant, and never take your peace of mind for granted. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next one.